At a national security summit, Kash Patel dismissed Jasmine Crockett as irrelevant and ordered her removal. But moments later, she calmly placed a red folder on the podium, a silent detonation that froze the entire room. The applause died, the camera zoomed in, and Patel's confidence began to crack. What was inside that folder that made him crumble on live TV? Stay with us, this is a story worth every second of your time. Beneath the towering arches of the Civic Center, Dallas, the air was too still, like a courtroom moments before sentencing. This wasn't just a conference, it was a stage for power cloaked in protocol. Every velvet chair held someone who had influence or had bought it. Over 800 attendees filled the room, retired generals with polished medals, defense contractors in press suits, and senators whispering to lobbyists behind folded programs. 10-foot banners read, "Securing the Homeland, a New Frontier," while the screen behind the podium rolled footage of armored trucks and surveillance drones, patriotism curated and choreographed. A voice crackled through the sound system. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mr. Kash Patel." It was the cue. The lights lifted. The applause came hard and fast, like something trained rather than earned. Kash Patel walked onto the stage with the ease of someone who had stood behind the curtain too long and now believed the spotlight was a right, not a privilege. In a perfectly tailored navy suit, he clasped the podium like a conductor waiting for silence. He didn't smile. He didn't need to. He began with words sharp as a headline. "We are investing millions," he said, "to protect America from chaos." The applause returned, more rhythmic this time, like confirmation. No one questioned what chaos meant or who defined it. Heads nodded. Phones rose. Aides took notes that no one would read. Patel scanned the room and saw everything he expected to see until the unexpected stepped in. The double doors at the back of the auditorium opened not gently, not apologetically, but with the weight of someone who wasn't asking for entry. Jasmine Crockett. Her entrance was not a disruption, it was a statement. She wore no clearance badge, no guest tag, no lapel pin to blend in. What she carried instead was a red folder under one arm, and in her presence, a stillness that grew louder with every step. Her blazer was storm gray, her expression surgical. She moved like someone walking into a hearing, not a gala. The audience didn't know how to react, only that they should. Heads turned. Phones stopped recording the stage and swiveled toward the aisle. A woman near the front whispered, "Who is that?" A staffer in a headset leaned toward the event coordinator. His voice clipped urgent. "She doesn't have clearance." Another stepped back from the aisle, eyes wide. "She's not on the program. I repeat, not on the program." For a moment, the lights overhead felt too bright, the room too exposed. From his place at the podium, Patel squinted through the beams of the stage lighting eyes, narrowing as if the light itself had betrayed him. The applause had not fully died when his expression shifted. It was no longer the face of a keynote speaker. It was the face of a gatekeeper who just saw the lock turn from the outside. Without adjusting his posture, without raising his voice, he leaned into the mic and delivered the sentence with the weight of someone who thought it still held power. "Remove her." But Crockett didn't flinch, not when the guards moved, not when the cameras turned, not even when the most powerful man in the room tried to erase her with a single command. She stopped just steps away from the front row, standing in the dead center of the aisle, as if she had been carved into the floor plan. Overhead, the spotlight caught the edge of her folder, a thick, battered binder, with a deep red cover that gleamed like blood beneath glass. No flourish, no announcement. She simply raised it with one hand, slow and deliberate, like lifting a weapon in a room full of generals. On the cover, printed in black block lettering, "Anonymous Funding, Kash Patel Links." The words weren't dramatic. They didn't need to be. The font was government plain, the kind you see on subpoenas and budget reports. But in this room built on applause contracts and curated fear, it landed like a thunderclap in a vault. You could almost feel the air buckle under its weight. Kash Patel, still at the podium, locked eyes with her. His fingers tightened on the microphone as if it could shield him. For a brief second, he seemed caught somewhere between disbelief and dread. But he recovered with a voice honed in back rooms and corridors of unchecked authority. "You don't have the right to be here." He said it like a rule, like a wall, as if rights were things handed out in envelopes by people like him. As if her presence in this room, her voice, her folder, her proof wasn't a breach of protocol but of hierarchy. What he meant was, this is not your stage. This is not your story. Crockett didn't flinch. She didn't blink. Her voice came low and steady, slicing through the tension like a wire through glass. I don't need the right. I have the receipts. She didn't raise her tone. She didn't posture. And that's what made the room go silent. The kind of silence that doesn't ask for attention, it demands it. The kind that drops when truth isn't whispered but confirmed. Every movement froze. Phones stopped recording. Staffers stopped scribbling. Even the guards hesitated as if something unspoken had shifted in the air. She didn't just hold up a folder. She held up the one thing no one in that room had expected: accountability. And just when the silence became too heavy to hold, Jasmine flipped the folder open, revealing not opinions, not accusations, but names that had never been meant for daylight. She didn't need to raise her voice. She only needed the truth. One by one, her words dropped like trapdoors beneath the foundation of the room. Stonefield Intel. The first name landed with a strange weight, obscure, unfamiliar, yet suddenly deeply relevant. Patriot Bridge Group, Vanguard Operatives, L&M National Consulting. Her tone was surgical, calm, unflinching. It wasn't performance, it was testimony. Eyes across the auditorium darted toward phones, some typing, some already searching. Others glanced toward Patel, waiting for denial, waiting for spin. But Jasmine kept going, unmoved. All four received lucrative contracts from local Homeland Security funds only after Mr. Patel left federal service. She said it plainly, like reading a budget summary. But the impact wasn't subtle. It felt like a knife slid through velvet. Behind her on the overhead screen, images began to appear, photos, not of high-rise offices or government buildings, but of blank doorways, shuttered windows, and nondescript storefronts in industrial zones. One showed a mailbox behind a chain-link fence. Another was clearly a UPS drop box. Her voice cut through again. According to Pogo, none of these entities maintain physical headquarters or documented staff. No payroll, no contact lines, no operating records. It was the kind of detail that couldn't be shouted down. It had been traced, verified, printed, and time-stamped. Jasmine wasn't holding allegations, she was holding infrastructure. Rotten, hollow, but real. A murmur stirred this time, not out of confusion, but recognition. A woman sitting near the aisle leaned sideways and whispered just loud enough to echo, "Shell companies." Another voice followed from the back, lower, but with more edge, "Ghost contracts." The entire room tilted with discomfort. The applause from earlier now seemed centuries old. Kash Patel stood rigid at the podium, blinking hard jaw set like stone. He stepped forward fast, clenching the microphone stand like a weapon. Then came the snap, his voice louder, harsher, tinged with exposed nerve. "That is slander." It wasn't calm. It wasn't calculated. It was raw. His words ricocheted off the walls, loud enough to cover the truth, but not strong enough to erase it. He wasn't issuing a denial. He was giving off the first real sign of fear. But Jasmine Crockett didn't move. The folder remained in her hand, unwavering. Her eyes stayed on him like a locked scope. In a chamber built to amplify power, she had just named what hid behind the curtain, and for the first time that night, power looked cornered. And as Patel's voice still echoed from the accusation of slander, Jasmine stepped forward not to argue, but to deliver proof that needed no defense. She turned slightly cool and composed and tapped a remote in her hand. The screen behind her shifted from the list of shell companies to something more damning, a scanned government contract, enlarged and projected, so no one could claim they hadn't seen it. The header stretched wide across the screen in bold serif font, Emergency Security Consulting, Contract City of El Paso. Beneath it, three details lit up in crimson red highlights: no bidding process. $12 million. Awarded to Patriot Bridge Group. A low gasp rolled across the crowd. No one blinked. No one spoke. Jasmine didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The numbers were louder than any accusation. No public bidding, she said. No competitive vetting. Just one line: urgent need. She let the phrase settle into every row, every conscience. She pointed slowly at the company name. Patriot Bridge Group. the same company she had named moments earlier as one of the four linked to Patel. Then she dropped the next hammer calmly without theatrics, like a prosecutor reading evidence already confirmed. The company was formed 7 weeks before the contract was signed. The words were cold, measured, and then the listed CEO, Mr. Patel's longtime friend, Mark Hensley. Her tone didn't accuse. It revealed. That distinction mattered. She wasn't speculating, she was unsealing, and the room knew it. Faces turned toward Patel again, only now with something colder than discomfort awareness. On the screen, a second slide appeared. Company registration documents dated and timestamped. Patriot Bridge Group didn't exist before the contract. It wasn't just a quiet deal. It was a precision job, time, position, and handed off behind closed doors. The kind of transaction that never shows up on a press release. Jasmine didn't move. She stood like a pillar, letting the paperwork speak for itself. The silence stretched thinner. And then from the third row, a voice broke it, shaky, sharp, and undeniable. A middle-aged man in a gray work jacket leaned forward, his words not meant for the microphone, but loud enough to carry. "That's my tax money." His tone wasn't political, it was personal. And that's what shifted the room. For the first time, this wasn't just about Patel. It was about every teacher who'd been told there was no funding for books. Every firefighter working without new gear. Every mother who'd waited 6 hours in an underfunded emergency room. $12 million had moved through the system without scrutiny, without competition, while entire communities were told to tighten belts. Patel stood frozen at the podium. The contract loomed behind him like a wall of undeniable proof. His earlier confidence, once polished and commanding, now looked brittle beneath the fluorescent lights. The audience, once warm and nodding, now sat still, no longer reacting with approval, but with the beginning sting of betrayal. And Crockett. She didn't gloat. She didn't flinch. She stood firm with only facts in her hands and fury in her silence. The red folder remained tucked under her arm, but the truth it held was already out, and it didn't need a raised voice to burn. But Jasmine wasn't finished, because behind every shadowy contract, there was someone who got left behind. And tonight she came to name them too. From the folder under her arm, Jasmine pulled a single 8/10 photo and raised it high, not with flair, but with the quiet weight of someone carrying a name that had been forgotten. It showed a modest brick school building in South Austin, the kind that blends into the neighborhoods most lawmakers never visit. The sign above the rusted fence read, James H. Turner Elementary, Austin ISD. The image flickered onto the main screen behind her, magnified for all to see. A cracked camera dangled above the entrance. Faded playground paint marked the outline of what once looked like safety. Jasmine stepped forward, voice slow but cutting. In 2022, this school applied for funding to upgrade its basic security secured entry doors, surveillance equipment, training for emergency lockdowns. She clicked the remote again. A scanned letter appeared, Texas Department of Public Safety decision notice. Denied. In the center of the page, one sentence glowed in bright yellow highlight. Request does not meet strategic priority criteria. It wasn't a rejection, it was an erasure. Jasmine let the words hang. They were denied, she repeated, her tone steady. Told they weren't strategically valuable enough to protect. The camera panned to faces in the audience. Some squirmed, some stared at the floor. This wasn't politics anymore. This was personal. Then she clicked once more, and the screen changed again. This time it showed 3 corporate logos with timestamps: Patriot Bridge Group, Vanguard Operatives, L&M National Consulting. Next to each name, grant amounts $4.2 million, $8 million, $3.5 million. Jasmine didn't look at the screen. She looked at the audience. During that same window, when Turner Elementary was turned away, 3 private companies received over $11.5 million in emergency security grants. The words were undeniable. No one could interrupt. None of them had schools to protect. None had public offices. But every one of them had something that school did not. She took one small step forward. Her voice didn't rise, but it sharpened like a blade sliding out of its sheath. Not everyone has friends in the right places. A beat of silence followed, but it wasn't empty. It was tense, alive, ashamed. The screen still showed the school. The decision letter still glowed. In a room built for contracts and handshakes, Jasmine had just forced everyone to look at a rusted school gate and ask why safety was ever something a child had to compete for. And just when the room thought it had heard the worst, Jasmine revealed what couldn't be spun, couldn't be denied, and couldn't be unsent, an email buried inside the very system meant to protect the public. She turned back to the screen, not with drama, but with a certainty that made the act feel surgical. One more click and suddenly the silence became charged again. The projected image was simple, a screenshot of an internal email, Department of Homeland Security letterhead, intact, time-stamped and authenticated. The sender was K. Patel. The date was September 14th, 2021, and the subject line read, Grant Prioritization, September Planning Brief. But it was the single line buried deep in the thread that made the air shift like pressure before a storm. KP recommends prioritizing companies with strong conservative values. Jasmine didn't add commentary. She didn't need to. The sentence glared like a siren in still air. There was no ambiguity, no layers of bureaucratic wording. It was plain raw favoritism, ideological loyalty as a condition for public funding. Gas rippled low across the room, not because it was shocking, but because it was admitted. This wasn't someone's accusation. It was Patel's own words sent from his government account now lit across a 30-foot screen. Some in the crowd looked stunned. Others looked betrayed. Jasmine stayed still, letting the weight of the words breathe across the chamber. For a moment, even the staffers stopped scribbling. This wasn't policy, it was prejudice baked into infrastructure. Patel's eyes darted across the screen. His fingers tapped once on the podium as if searching for footing. Then finally, the response came measured, cautious, and all too familiar. I don't recall that email. The phrase echoed with the hollowness of practiced denial. It wasn't bold enough to be a lie, but not brave enough to be the truth. He said it like a man hiding behind fog. A few heads turned sharply. Some in the crowd exchanged looks. The tension was no longer between Crockett and Patel. It was between Patel and the paper trail. Jasmine didn't move. Her face didn't shift. But her voice came low and controlled each word, paced like a ticking clock. Then do you remember where the money went? The line cut through the air like a scalpel. Clean, precise, brutal. It wasn't a soundbite. It was a charge. The audience froze. Breaths held, brows furrowed. Because forgetting a sentence is one thing. Forgetting $11.5 million is another. She didn't raise her tone. She didn't need to. The question sat heavy in the center of the room, impossible to dodge, impossible to forget. It didn't ask for an answer. It demanded accountability. And in that moment, silence became the loudest admission of all. And just when it seemed Patel's words couldn't stretch any thinner, Jasmine turned the spotlight to those who had paid the price for his priorities, not on paper, but in pain. She lifted the remote again slowly this time, as if even she needed a breath before what came next. The room held still as though time itself braced. The screen flickered, then snapped into focus. There, frozen in a grainy frame, was an image that didn't need explanation. An elderly black woman lay collapsed in the hallway of a public school. Her thin frame twisted, her arm caught under her side. Her glasses shattered just inches from her fingers. Her face was turned just enough for the audience to see the anguish, the confusion. In the bottom corner of the surveillance footage, the timestamp burned into the crowd's vision, 2:13 p.m., March 7th, 2023, Eastfield Elementary. Jasmine said nothing at first. The silence grew loud. Then her voice returned, not with volume, but with something heavier. She was delivering lunch to her great-granddaughter's class. She paused, letting the line breathe. She tripped over a buckled tile in the hallway. No one saw her for 27 minutes. Another beat passed. The hallway camera, one of only two in the building, hadn't worked in 7 months. Her words weren't emotional, but the room felt like it had been stripped raw. She turned toward the audience. And the school's security grant request, her voice dipped. Denied. There was a visible shift in the audience, like air tightening in lungs. People weren't just watching now. They were absorbing. The woman in the photo could have been anyone's grandmother. And the rejection wasn't just a policy, now it was a wound. Jasmine tapped the remote again. The screen divided in two. On the left, the photo of the fallen woman remained. On the right, a new list scrolled down a cold ledger of rejection: 23 Texas public schools. Security grant applications denied 2021-2023. The names lit up town by town: Austin, El Paso, Lubbock, Beaumont. Each row ended with the same stamped phrase, "not strategically aligned." Jasmine read none of them aloud. She didn't need to. The repetition stung on its own. Every single one of these schools, she said, asked for basic protection: secure doors, working surveillance, emergency response drills. Some were in communities with rising break-ins. Others had reports of attempted abductions just blocks away. She looked back at the list, her voice steady, and every single one was told, "You don't qualify." She stepped toward the edge of the stage, her heels clicking with purpose. The lights reflected off the photo behind her, her silhouette cast against the broken body of a grandmother forgotten by bureaucracy. "This isn't about partisanship," she said. "This isn't red versus blue. This is right versus wrong." Her words didn't rush, they struck. Each sentence another knock on the fragile shell of Patel's defense. Then she stopped, turned toward Patel directly, and said it not as an attack, but as a truth that couldn't be dodged. "This is the real face of Homeland Security under your leadership." Gasps rippled, not because it was shocking, but because it clarified everything. The list of schools still scrolled slowly behind her, silent, unforgiving. Patel stood frozen, his jaw, tight eyes fixed somewhere below the screen. His hands, once steady on the podium, now clenched subtly at the edge. No one moved, no one interrupted. Not even the moderators. Because at that moment, Crockett wasn't making a point, she was delivering a reckoning. And in the middle of a hall filled with power, money, and carefully curated patriotism, she had forced the country to look at something it could no longer unsee. Not the broken politics, but the broken people they left behind. And just as the weight of Jasmine's evidence settled over the room like a storm cloud, ready to break, the first voice to rise wasn't hers or Patel's, but a man who had worn the system's promise on his chest. He stood from the fifth row like a monument, slowly waking, his stature still proud, though age had crept into his frame. The stripes on his lapel were faded, but the posture was unshakable, military through and through. A hush spread in a widening circle around him, the way water ripples when a stone finally breaks the surface. He didn't clear his throat. He didn't seek permission. When he spoke, it was with the cadence of someone who had once shouted orders across battlegrounds, but now spoke with something far more devastating: disappointment. "I used to believe in the system. Now I see it's been sold off." His words didn't echo, they cut. They didn't challenge authority, they mourned it. The silence that followed was the kind no one dared interrupt. Jasmine didn't speak. Patel didn't flinch. The audience around the man looked at him, not as a stranger, but as a mirror. People who once sat comfortably now leaned forward, as if hearing something they'd long felt but never dared say. A woman near the aisle nodded slowly. A younger man in a tailored suit lowered his eyes. It wasn't just a statement. It was a verdict delivered not by Jasmine, but by someone the system once asked everything of. The applause didn't start with a thunderclap. It began gently, hands clasping in cautious rhythm. Then it built, across rows, across aisles, not because of a political side, but because of a shared fracture finally made visible. And as the momentum rose, it turned. It didn't face Patel. It faced Jasmine, a woman who'd walked into that hall, uninvited, unwelcomed, and outnumbered, now stood in the center of it as the only one being heard. The camera operators didn't need direction. They zoomed in on the faces, the disbelief, the release, veterans clapping alongside school teachers, retired officers nodding next to community organizers. Even a few lobbyists, hesitant, conflicted, found their hands moving, not out of loyalty, but out of respect. Jasmine didn't smile. She didn't bow. She simply stood there, utterly still, like someone holding ground not for herself, but for the names no one else dared say aloud. And then from the stage, the voice that once commanded the room tried to claw it back. "This is political theater," Patel barked, his voice sharp, now strained with something between fury and fear. His hands were no longer steady. They gripped the edge of the podium with the stiffness of a man feeling control slipping through his fingers. His jaw clenched, his eyes darted. "This is a stunt, a setup, an ambush." He paused, perhaps expecting anyone to jump in to rescue him, to realign the narrative. But the room had shifted, permanently. It wasn't just the evidence. It wasn't just the photos or the contracts. It was that man's voice, the one that had nothing to gain by standing up but everything to lose by staying silent. Patel's words fell into that vacuum like stones dropped into mud. No one moved to applaud. No one nodded. Even his own allies, those in pressed suits and guarded expressions, began avoiding eye contact. The narrative had cracked, and from the fracture, something dangerous had emerged. Truth. Jasmine finally stepped forward. No fanfare. No fire. Her heels clicked softly across the polished stage floor as she moved beside the podium, not behind it. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't raise her arms. But her words landed like judgment carved in marble. No. Her tone was steady, resolute. This is a bill long overdue, and it's finally being paid in truth. You could hear the breath leave the room, not in panic, in release, like someone had finally put words to what had been choking them for years. The phrase didn't need to be shouted. It didn't need approval. It stood by itself. Brutal, beautiful, complete. That single sentence did what an hour of documents couldn't. It made the story human, not about contracts, not about positions, but about consequences. Consequences paid in school hallways, in denied grants, in the quiet rage of those who wore the flag, only to see it traded away behind closed doors. The veteran who had spoken nodded once slowly, as if saluting her not with his hand, but with his memory. More audience members followed, not out of partisanship, but out of something deeper, moral alignment. The kind you don't post about. The kind that shapes what you teach your children. Patel said nothing more. He couldn't. Because there are moments in history when noise becomes useless, when spectacle breaks, when the simplest sentence delivers more impact than 1,000 press releases. And in that moment, Jasmine Crockett didn't just win the room, she changed it. Forever. But as the lights dimmed inside the Civic Center and the echoes of Crockett's truth still hung heavy in the air, the retaliation began, calculated, precise, and louder than ever. By the next morning, the Republican response was already in motion. Conservative news anchors framed the hearing as a hit job. Editorial boards used words like reckless, unprofessional, and borderline unethical. And on Capitol Hill, the GOP issued a coordinated statement condemning Jasmine Crockett in the strongest possible terms she had. They claimed deliberately twisted the facts and slandered a private citizen exercising his constitutional rights. It was not a rebuttal. It was a smokescreen. They weren't defending truth, they were defending power. Crockett was now painted as a rogue disruptor, a dangerous figure who had crossed some invisible line. Former officials went on record calling her presentation an embarrassment to the institution. But their outrage, no matter how loud, could not bury what had already been released. Because while the political class rushed to discredit her, the investigative press began digging. By midweek, the silence she had shattered in Dallas was echoing across major newsrooms. Politico and ProPublica, two outlets known for deep investigative reporting, independently confirmed a chilling pattern. Two of the companies named in Crockett's folder, Stonefield Intel LLC and Patriot Bridge Group, were legally registered but operationally vacant. No staff directories, no functioning phone lines, no sign of legitimate business activity, and yet each had secured multi-million-dollar national security contracts under emergency provisions contracts that bypassed standard bidding procedures entirely. According to federal procurement filings, Patriot Bridge Group was awarded a $4.5 million contract just 7 weeks after it was incorporated. The stated purpose, emergency urban threat assessment. But the company had no public record of past work, no known personnel, and its listed office turned out to be a shared mailbox inside a strip mall accounting firm. Worse documents traced both firms back to known shell companies previously cited in unrelated money laundering investigations. The red flags weren't subtle, they were systemic. Civil society reacted immediately. The Brennan Center for Justice issued a call for congressional oversight hearings. The Project on Government Oversight released a dossier urging the Office of the Inspector General to launch a joint audit. Even the ACLU weighed in, warning that undisclosed security spending tied to shadowy firms posed a direct threat to public transparency and democratic accountability. Across state capitals, local newspapers asked a single burning question: how did no one catch this until now? And as pressure mounted, reporters turned to the man at the center of it all, Kash Patel. He had spoken boldly on stage just days earlier, commanding the microphone, dismissing Crockett as a disruption. But now he disappeared. Requests for comment poured into his office. Television crews staked out his last known consulting address. Press secretaries deflected. Publicists gave no quotes. And then after 3 days of silence, a single line was released to the media: Mr. Patel declines to comment and has no further statements at this time. It wasn't an explanation, it was a retreat. And for those who had once clapped for him, that silence was more damning than anything Crockett had said. But while Kash Patel's silence festered behind closed doors and heavily worded statements, the country was already responding not with policy memos, but with raw memory outrage and one unforgettable sentence that tore through the noise like a blade. The clip was grainy, recorded from the side by a bystander's phone, not an official camera. It wasn't polished, wasn't framed with stage lighting or political choreography. It didn't need to be. Jasmine Crockett stood still, a red folder. Still in hand, face unreadable, but voice razor sharp. She didn't shout. She didn't flinch. She just let the silence drag until every eye was locked, and then said it. You call it security. I call it corruption in uniform. That line didn't stay in the room. It exploded out of it. In the first 20 minutes, the clip was posted to 3 activist accounts. By the first hour, it had been shared by independent journalists, combat veterans, public school teachers, and nurses who hadn't had hazard pay since 2021. And by hour 8, it had passed 5 million views. No trending hashtag, no corporate boost, just momentum pure, people-driven wildfire fast. The comment sections weren't filled with memes or hot takes. They were filled with names, with school districts, with counties, with contracts people remembered signing, services they never received, clinics that closed while national security budgets ballooned. A librarian in Detroit wrote, "My building was shut down in 2022 because there was no funding. I guess that money was too busy keeping us safe." An EMT in Albuquerque posted a blurred photo of a cracked oxygen tank. "No one replaced this because there was a budget freeze. Where was Patel's emergency when I needed it?" And then came the veterans. A retired Air Force engineer from Kentucky posted a selfie in his basement oxygen machine, in the corner, government rejection letter in hand. "I filed for support 3 times, he wrote. "They told me the fund was exhausted. But this guy funneled $12 million to a shell company. Don't talk to me about security. Talk to me about betrayal." His post hit 40,000 shares in 6 hours. News anchors started referencing it on live air, eyes wide, tone solemn. One anchor paused during coverage and simply said, "I don't think this story's going away." It wasn't a news cycle. It was a reckoning. And the people leading it weren't senators or columnists. They were survivors of a system that had turned public need into private gain. Jasmine's 12-second clip became a watermark, evidence not of corruption's existence, but of its acceptance, its normalization. For years, people had been told that budget cuts were necessary, that sacrifices had to be made, that security demanded trade-offs. But now, with 4 company names and 1 red folder, Crockett had exposed the lie at the center of it all. Security wasn't being bought. It was being sold to friends, to insiders, to consultants with no badges, but the right connections. A professor from Howard University released a statement on behalf of a coalition of Black educators, writing, "This is what it looks like when national policy is crafted by people who never had to walk past a closed rec center or bury a child lost to underfunded trauma care." Across TikTok and Instagram, younger voices joined in, remixing the clip over sirens, classroom shots, and empty grocery shelves in under-policed neighborhoods. The phrase "corruption in uniform" was turned into song lyrics, art collages, even a spoken word performance live-streamed from a park in Atlanta. Meanwhile, the official response struggled to keep up. Right-wing commentators tried to discredit the video, claiming it lacked context. But every new attempt to spin it only boosted its reach. The public didn't need context, they lived it. Jasmine's words weren't speculative, they were descriptive. They captured what tens of millions had felt but never seen named on a screen under a spotlight in a room full of generals and millionaires. The system had used the word security to justify everything. Now it was being used against them. Journalists who had covered defense budgets for decades began calling this a watershed moment. Late-night hosts opened with monologues quoting Jasmine directly. Local newspapers from El Paso to Raleigh ran op-eds from school board members and firefighters, people who'd watched their funding disappear while Patel's contracts quietly multiplied. And through it all, Jasmine never changed her tone. She didn't launch a media tour. She didn't tweet back at her critics. She simply let the truth stand exactly as she had spoken it, with a calm that made her enemies nervous. She wasn't yelling. She didn't have to. Because when the system finally looks in the mirror, it doesn't need volume. It needs reflection. And this time, it was forced to look. While millions were still replaying that 12-second clip on their phones, Jasmine Crockett stepped off the digital battlefield and walked into a forgotten front line, a place where the headlines never reached, and where the cost of corruption wore sneakers and carried backpacks. The building sat on the edge of a quiet neighborhood in South Dallas, surrounded by overgrown fences and weathered murals of smiling children that time and budget cuts had left behind. The flag outside was frayed at the edges, its pole rusted near the base. No media vans were parked on the curb. No security details followed. Jasmine Crockett arrived alone, her heels clicking softly on the uneven concrete as she approached the school's front entrance, one hand holding a plain folder, the other in her coat pocket. No entourage, no press release, just a quiet visit, the kind politicians usually skipped once the cameras stopped rolling. Inside, the hallways smelled of cleaning bleach and cafeteria grease. The bulletin boards were lined with construction paper suns and faded photos of school assemblies from years ago. A janitor nodded at her as she passed, confused for a moment before recognizing her face. "That woman from the clip," he whispered under his breath. But Jasmine didn't pause. She moved quietly through the hallway, brushing her fingers across a door frame where chipped paint revealed layers of color from years past, beige mint, then blue. She had been here before. Not this school, maybe, but places just like it. Places where children were asked to make sense of a system built to overlook them. The classroom had no stage, no flags, no teleprompter. Just a whiteboard with the day's schedule written in dry erase marker 9, Ojo AM special guest conversation on leadership. There were 30 students. Most sat with cautious curiosity, unsure of who the special guest really was. Jasmine pulled a tiny plastic chair from the corner, the kind built for smaller bodies, and sat down slowly, her knees nearly to her chest. Her eyes met theirs, level, not elevated. "Hey," she said simply. "Let's talk about money." They stared at her. One boy laughed nervously. "You mean like dollars?" Jasmine smiled gently. "Yes. But also no, I mean budgets, the kind that decide whether your school gets new textbooks or more security guards, whether your lunch is hot or just processed, whether your classroom heater works when it's 30 degrees in January." One girl at the back of the room raised her hand, her sleeve covering half her face. "Why are you here?" That question hung in the air longer than expected, and Jasmine took her time. Because she said, you deserve to know that the numbers adults argue about, the ones in big folders and bigger buildings, they're not just math. They're stories. And those stories have winners and losers. Budgets, she added, are moral documents. They don't just tell us what we spend. They tell us who we're willing to protect and who we've already decided to forget. The room shifted, chairs creaked, pencils were slowly placed on desks. This didn't sound like a guest speaker. It sounded like truth. She leaned forward slightly. "Do any of you know what happened last week in Dallas?" Several nodded. One student whispered to another. "She exposed that guy with the companies." A boy in the front row muttered, "My dad was watching that clip." Got real quiet. But it was a girl, small, maybe 10, with tight braids and a nervous energy, who asked the question no one else had the nerve to say out loud. Was our school's protection money stolen? There was no giggling, no mocking. The room went dead still. Jasmine looked directly at her, not past her, not over her, at her. And she didn't offer platitudes. She didn't talk around it. Instead, she let the silence settle, not to dodge the question, but to honor the weight behind it. Then she said slowly, but with the same steel resolve she had used on stage just days earlier. When bad people have power, sometimes the bravest thing you can do is scream in the middle of the room they own. The girl blinked, then nodded, as if she already knew, because in that moment every child in that room understood they were in that room. Their classroom was that room. Their lives were part of the story. This wasn't abstract corruption, it was proximate. It was in their worn textbooks, their broken intercom system, their school nurse who only worked part-time now. Jasmine reached into her folder and pulled out a single page, not for drama, but for truth. It was a printout of the denied funding request their school had filed in 2022. One line was highlighted, not aligned with national security prioritization strategy. She held it up, let it hang there for a second. This, she said, was how they justified it. Said it didn't meet strategic criteria. Meanwhile, companies with no employees got $12 million contracts. A student near the windows whispered, "But we needed locks on the bathroom doors." Another added, "We haven't had a drill in like a year." Jasmine didn't interrupt. She didn't correct them. She listened. That was the most revolutionary part. She let their voices fill the space the same way she'd taken space from Patel in that auditorium. Only here she didn't need a spotlight. She had something stronger, shared understanding. One student raised his hand, hesitant. "So, what can we do?" Jasmine leaned back, her voice soft now. "You ask questions. You talk to each other. You hold people accountable. And when someone tells you the system is broken, you remember it's not broken. It was built this way to leave certain people out. And the most dangerous thing you can do in a world like that is pay attention." The bell rang faintly outside, a distant sound that didn't quite reach the room. No one stood. No one packed up. They were waiting, listening. And Jasmine Crockett, the woman who'd gone toe-to-toe with contractors, congressmen, and the cost of silence, just nodded and said, "You're not powerless. They just hope you believe you are." The teacher standing near the back wiped his eyes discreetly. No media captured this. No quote went viral. But if you'd been in that room that day, that hour, you wouldn't have needed a camera to remember it. You would have understood that power had just shifted, not in a speech, not in a vote, but in a classroom with no microphones, no slogans. And 30 wide-eyed witnesses finally told the truth. By the time Jasmine Crockett's truth had rippled from school classrooms to broken municipal budgets, the weight of her evidence had become undeniable and uncontainable. In a matter of hours, the silence that Kash Patel had used as his shield began to fracture under the pressure of a far louder forced scrutiny. Not whispers, not speculation, but headlines. Real ones, typed, printed, and broadcast by the very institutions that once danced carefully around men like him. It began with a single banner stretched across the New York Times digital front page. Did Kash Patel profit from the security system? The question wasn't rhetorical, it was pointed, underscored by a chilling subheading: Federal records suggest contract misconduct in post-government dealings. It landed like a gavel, clean and final. Inside the article, readers were greeted not by partisan language, but by crisp summaries of documents. Crockett had publicly referenced contracts awarded without bids, advisory deals signed days before deadlines, and shell companies that led nowhere except to a single address in Northern Virginia. By noon, PBS NewsHour had aired a special segment titled "Uniform Corruption," a somber montage that opened with Patel's own voice declaring the need to protect America by any means necessary. The irony echoed hard against a narrative now unraveling with receipts. The segment intercut Jasmine's confrontation in Dallas with expert commentary from federal ethics advisors, one of whom declared flatly, "This reeks of procurement fraud." Another warned, "These aren't isolated events. They point to a pattern, coordinated misuse of federal trust for private gain." But it was the Texas Tribune that delivered the deepest blow. Its investigative team, known for their relentless focus on regional accountability, released a sprawling expose titled "5 Emergency Contracts, Zero Competition: The Unseen Network Behind Texas Homeland Spending." In over 4,000 meticulously researched words, they mapped out Patel's known associates, funding timelines, and how millions in expedited grants curiously found their way into LLCs that didn't exist before 2021. Readers clicked on interactive maps showing phantom offices. They zoomed in on tax records. They followed a digital trail that for the first time made Patel's post-government wealth look not just suspicious, but orchestrated. As the media barrage intensified, pressure inside Washington exploded. Staffers on the House Budget Committee were photographed carrying thick folders into private chambers. Journalists swarmed the Capitol Rotunda, waiting for a single line of confirmation. And they got it cold, legal, and undeniable. A federal subcommittee will reopen investigation into 5 contracts awarded between 2021 and 2022 connected to former advisor Kash Patel. It wasn't just a headline anymore. It was a government action. The 5 contracts in question totaled over $45 million and involved 3 entities previously highlighted by Crockett. All had received money under emergency national security provisions. None had undergone traditional bidding, and each had ties documented or financial to Patel's known circle of influence. The subcommittee's brief included keywords like conflict of interest, failure to disclose, and improper influence. Quietly but unmistakably, they also mentioned the possibility of criminal referral if warranted. Inside the political sphere, lines began to shift. Lawmakers who once praised Patel's decisiveness now refused to comment. One senator was caught on a hot mic saying he should have stayed out of the money. That's where they always get you. Political consultants began rewriting talking points. Donors started making nervous calls to compliance lawyers. And throughout it all, Patel stayed silent. When asked for comment by the Times, his office responded with a single-line statement: "Mr. Patel stands by his record and will cooperate if necessary." That line didn't buy him grace. It bought him suspicion. Because by now the public wasn't just watching, they were piecing together the betrayal. They remembered the schools that couldn't get cameras, the veterans who were denied mental health services, the cities that were told they didn't qualify for protection. And when they compared those sacrifices to the suspicious speed with which Patel's allies were funded, one phrase began surfacing across social media, in blog posts and radio call-ins and grassroots protests. He didn't forget us. He sold us. This wasn't political theater anymore. It was moral revelation unfolding in real time, under real lights with real consequences. And the man who once called himself a guardian of national security now stood at the edge of a very different kind of inquiry, one that wouldn't ask him how he protected America, but how much he charged for it. As federal hearings escalated and headlines thundered with names and numbers no longer buried as shift took place, not in courtrooms or newsrooms, but in the unlit corners of public trust. Patel's silence, once calculated, had begun to grow brittle under the national microscope. Gone were the deflective smiles. Gone was the shrug of plausible deniability. And in its place came something far more dangerous: the need to reassert control over the narrative. He didn't choose a press conference. He didn't appear on a debate stage. Instead, Kash Patel emerged in a video, released exclusively through a conservative digital network, filmed in what looked like a reclaimed bunker studio. The lighting was sharp and clinical. The background was a deep steel blue, a large American flag mounted behind him, creased slightly at the top right corner, as if hastily pinned. Beside the flag, in stark white font over metal plating, the words "Restoring Honor." Below that, strength, security, sovereignty. He looked straight into the lens. No podium, no papers. Just him sitting stiff in a high-backed chair that mimicked military issue. "I will not back down in the face of destructive forces," Patel said, voice low, almost surgical. The words dripped with rehearsed defiance. "This nation is being hijacked by individuals who claim to fight for the people while waging war on its protectors. I know the truth. I've lived it, and I will not let lies rewrite that truth." There was no mention of contracts, no mention of companies, no mention of Crockett, but his message was unmistakably about her. And every viewer, whether loyalist or skeptic, felt the friction in his tone. He wasn't simply trying to clear his name. He was rearming it, positioning himself not as the accused, but as the last man standing in a siege against chaos. The video racked up 2 million views in its first day. It played well in echo chambers, especially among groups that clung to a binary version of America's savior versus saboteur, order versus rebellion. But something curious happened outside that bubble. The wider public, instead of locking eyes with Patel's performance, turned their attention elsewhere toward a clip that wasn't polished, wasn't filmed in a studio, and wasn't even supposed to go viral. A sixth-grade teacher from East Austin uploaded a grainy 38-second video from inside her classroom. No title, no caption, just the raw frame of Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett standing before a small group of students holding up a piece of paper under yellow classroom lights. No podium, no microphone, no handlers, just a whiteboard behind her filled with multiplication tables, and her hand gripping a wrinkled sheet that bore the unmistakable look of a spreadsheet printed from an overworked home printer. At the top, barely visible but unmistakable in red ink, the label read, Emergency Security Allocations, FY 2022. It wasn't flashy, but it was damning. She read aloud a few of the items on the list. Stonefield Intel, $4.8 million. Patriot Bridge Group, $6.7 million. Vanguard Operatives. A student interrupted her. Is that real? Crockett looked at him not with outrage or performance, but with the quiet gravity of someone too tired to pretend anymore. It's real, she said. This is what some people call strategy. I call it a bill that no one paid with honesty. The classroom went quiet. You could hear the hum of a projector in the background. One child fiddled with the corner of her notebook. Another bit his lip. But one girl, maybe 9 or 10 years old, whispered, "Is that why our cameras don't work?" Crockett didn't answer directly. She just lowered the sheet, folded it, and said quietly, "When people in power forget who the money was meant for, sometimes the only thing you can do is shout in the middle of a room they think they own." That single clip spread like wildfire. It didn't go through cable news anchors or digital PR firms. It didn't need algorithms to trend. It moved through WhatsApp chains, teacher forums, PTA boards, and student-led TikTok channels. Within hours, the phrase, "a bill no one paid with honesty," became a rallying cry for educators, veterans, and social workers. It was printed on cardboard signs and taped to break room walls in underfunded schools. It was scrawled on protest banners in front of courthouses. One principal in Arizona pinned it on every classroom door with a note, "This is what happens when silence is funded." But Crockett herself said nothing. She didn't post the video. She didn't retweet it. She didn't hold a press conference to capitalize on it. Because she knew what Patel didn't silence only protects you when the people still trust you to speak. And the people, those children, those teachers, those parents weren't waiting for him to speak anymore. They had found their voice in a wrinkled sheet of ink-stained numbers held up in a dusty classroom by a woman who never once raised her voice, but made the system shake anyway. While Patel rearmed himself in front of flags and slogans, Crockett stood where the damage was counted, not denied. He had broadcast a message to the world. She had whispered a truth it could no longer ignore. The video had ended. The room was empty. But in living rooms, classrooms, and break rooms across the country, the impact was just beginning. Jasmine Crockett hadn't yelled. She hadn't begged. She hadn't even raised her voice. But somehow her calm voice, measured deliberate and heavy with suppressed fury, had cut through more noise than any microphone ever could. As the footage of her holding up the red folder spread like wildfire, it wasn't the headlines that mattered anymore. It was the quiet echoes that followed. She said it. She showed it. She didn't flinch. It wasn't a press conference. It was a reckoning. By the time she raised the single sheet with the list of names and dollar signs, the air had already changed. Kash Patel had dismissed it as political theater. But the theater had left the stage. Now it was living inside people. The numbers were no longer abstract. They were children's lunchroom locks left unrepaired. They were nurses cut from school budgets to make room for consultant fees. They were after-school programs that vanished, replaced by faceless companies with vague missions and bloated invoices. It wasn't a scandal because it was secret. It was a scandal because it had been seen and tolerated. Until now. And that was Jasmine's real power, not exposure, but focus. She didn't accuse. She connected. She didn't make the story about her. She made it about the people who never get to stand in the room where power plays out its rituals. The mother in El Paso who begged for campus cameras. The school in Austin told their need wasn't strategic enough. The veterans whose sense of duty had been quietly sold to the highest bidder. And then came the clip. Crockett eyes locked on Patel's as he ranted off script, simply stated, "You call that security. I call it corruption in uniform." 9 words. No theatrics, no pause. Just truth loaded like a freight train. In less than 8 hours, the clip passed 5 million views. But more telling than the number was the kind of people who shared it. Teachers, janitors, veterans, community college students, people who weren't usually part of Washington's echo chamber. Their captions weren't political, they were personal. "This is what happened at my school. We asked for funding, they sent thoughts. We got audits, they got grants. And then came the stories." A high school teacher in Houston posted a video from 2021 of kids practicing lockdown drills with chairs stacked against doors. No intercom, no buzzers. A mother in Arizona wrote a thread about her son's school being denied new perimeter fencing due to budget shortfalls just weeks before a $9 million contract was awarded to a firm linked to a Patel associate. A retired Marine from Kentucky shared a photo of his denied application to run security programs at under-resourced public schools, rejected in favor of a more scalable solution from a tech firm no one had heard of. They weren't journalists. They were witnesses. And Crockett had cracked the dam. But what she didn't do was equally powerful. She didn't chase the fame. She didn't line up interviews or sell her story to networks. Instead, she showed up at a small school. No press, no entourage. Just her and a group of 5th graders with wide eyes and sharper questions than most senators. That was when the now iconic question came. "Is the money for our school's security gone?" one child asked. Jasmine paused. Her face didn't harden, but it didn't soften either. She looked the student in the eye, not as a politician trying to console, but as a human trying to be honest. And she replied, "When bad people have power, sometimes the best thing we can do is shout the truth right in the middle of the room they own." That line never made a press release, but it ended up in more classrooms than any campaign ad ever would. Teachers wrote it in chalk on classroom walls. Students repeated it in essays. One civics teacher in New Orleans even turned it into a daily journal prompt. "What room are you willing to shout in?" And that is what made this moment different. It wasn't about the fall of one man. It wasn't about Patel. It was about every system that allowed people like him to rise unchallenged. Crockett had revealed something larger than fraud. She had shown the architecture of favoritism, the policies written in invisible ink, the friends quietly installed behind glass doors, and she did it not to win a debate, but to remind the country of something we forget too often. Budgets are not spreadsheets. They are moral documents. Every dollar tells a story about who is protected and who is forgotten. Every line item is a statement of belief, and when those numbers become corrupted, it isn't just money lost, it's faith. Faith in institutions, faith in fairness, faith in the promise that public service means serving the public. Jasmine didn't restore that faith. That wasn't her goal. But she did something more vital. She reminded us it was missing. That's why the clip wasn't just viral, it was vital. Because for once, the country didn't see a politician grandstanding. It saw a woman walking into a room she was never supposed to enter, holding a folder no one wanted to see, and speaking a truth that cost her nothing but might cost someone else everything. And in the echoes of that truth, something shifted. A classroom felt seen. A contract got reviewed. A story got told. Not because the system changed overnight, but because for the first time in a long time, someone shouted in the room they weren't invited to. And they couldn't be ignored. And in the echoes of that truth, something shifted, but shifts mean nothing without footsteps to follow them. What Jasmine Crockett did wasn't a performance. It wasn't for show. It was risk, real risk. Walking into a fortified room built on silence and daring to speak in the one language they can't mute evidence. And she didn't walk in with a mob or a microphone. She walked in with receipts. Receipts paid for with the futures of children, the dignity of veterans, and the silence of too many who knew too much for too long. But a confrontation like that, as powerful as it was, cannot be the end of the story. Because if the only impact of truth is applause, then all we've done is clap at a fire we refuse to put out. Now comes the moment where the story stops being hers and becomes ours. Every rigged contract revealed, every shuttered school, every dollar diverted into a shell company run by someone's old roommate. That's not just theft. That's a crime scene with no yellow tape, no sirens. Just a quiet budget vote, a sealed email, and a public that was never supposed to look too closely. But now we've looked. And the question becomes, do we keep looking or do we start digging? Because this isn't about politics. It's about proximity. It's about how close corruption can get before we finally say, no more. Jasmine Crockett didn't scream. She didn't beg. She didn't accuse. She simply held up the bill and asked who signed it. That's not a political act. That's a civic one. And it's ours to echo. So what now if you're a parent? Demand to see the budget that funds your child's safety. Ask who got paid. Ask why your school didn't. If you're a student, don't let cynicism replace your courage. Your questions are more powerful than their excuses. If you're a veteran, know that your service is not a currency they get to spend without your consent. If you're an educator, bring this story into your classroom not as a scandal, but as a lesson in power integrity and what it costs to speak out. And if you work in the system, know this, the walls are thinner now. The public is listening. And if you've stayed silent for fear of what speaking out might do to you, let what Jasmine did be proof of what silence has already done to others. This is your moment too. Start by demanding audits on every defense grant issued without competitive bidding. Call your representatives. Share the names of companies with no office but six-figure contracts. Hold town halls. Push for citizen oversight of emergency spending. Make them spell out where the money went and why it never arrived where it was needed. Use your voice as the receipt they never counted on. Because this isn't a story of corruption. It's a story of normalization, of how easily people learn to accept the theft of the public good when it's dressed in patriotic language and signed with official pens. But we are not props in someone else's policy. We are not passive consumers of injustice. We are the owners of this country's narrative, and it's time we start rewriting the chapter they tried to skip. Thank you for watching until this moment, and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.